Good evening. Welcome, welcome, welcome. For some of you, can you just raise your hand? Is this your first event as part of this weekend? Okay. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Part of my responsibility for welcoming you and my pleasure in welcoming you to this part of the event is to let you understand how this all evolved. Please know that the people on the event committee, led so ably by Eve Hart Rice, never felt that this was the culmination of acknowledging the first women. This is the launch of acknowledging first women. This evening, this weekend, started almost 4 years ago at the lunch table of Marta Moret. She brought together, for whatever reason, a number of women. It was a small group, but included was Eve Rice from the class of 73, Connie Royster from the class of 72. I was there from the class of 71. Linda Lorimer was there as being a pivotal person involved and interested in what's happening with women and what's happening across the university. And a number of other people kind of came in and out with some of those meetings. But it started almost 4 years ago as we were talking about women at Yale, what's happening now, what happened in the past, how do we acknowledge our past? How does that get infused and transferred and documented and encouraged among the women who are here now? How have we gone out into the world? How did we get here? And in that process, as we talked about women across Yale and realized upcoming was the 150th anniversary of women at the university because the first ones came in 1869. And those of us who came to the college came in 1969. We wanted to do things that would really put in perspective, what did we face? We know that there were women who came before us who had it harder than we did. What happened to those women who came when there was only one woman here at the law school, or only two people at the graduate school, or only maybe one person at the medical school? We know they had a difficult time. And so we are not here to diminish anything that they went through or however they handled themselves or what the university was like then. But we know that even women who came to the college maybe in 1967 or even 1980 may have had a difficult time. It's not to diminish that. But one of the things we felt truly was that the women who came when we did had a unique experience. It took having a critical mass coming at the same time specifically to the college that changed the life of every woman at this university. It meant a push for more faculty. It meant a push for more administrators. It meant a push for all kinds of things. And in this conversation, we acknowledge that there were men in our classes and who preceded us who helped to make this happen. We do not diminish that at all. And we knew that there were men who came with us who really are our staunch allies. But the key thing that we kept saying to ourselves is, many of us never knew each other when we were here. We were spread out across the 12 residential colleges. And even the women who came and were at Vanderbilt were not necessarily encouraged to meet together. And it's not as though we wanted to be isolated from anybody in this room who was really one of our staunch allies. But we felt that this was our pivotal chance to encourage, invite, acknowledge, and see all around us the women we had never met before or who only saw for a few times on campus 50 years ago, but had never kept in touch with. And so that's why the focus was to have the core women who came in 1969. Whether we stayed or not, the pivotal thing was to keep saying, what would bring us together? What would acknowledge? What would make people feel safe, protected, feel like they want to tell their stories? We wanted to document it in the way that might be best for everybody. And we know that some people have come back to reunions, and we're glad of that. And that we have heard there are people who've never stepped foot in Yale again. So we would rather err on the side of repeating something that maybe some people saw before or heard before, so that the people who never came back felt that they had a unifying experience and that they were understanding and seeing what has changed at Yale, how you made an impact at Yale, what your legacy is here at Yale. So, having said those things, I try to at least acknowledge to those of you who may have felt left out why we did what we did, how we came to be here right now, and to welcome you to understanding why we admire you, we respect you, but we felt that we needed to have time to meet with one another, so that in some of the sessions that are really closed to anybody other than the people from 1969, please understand, it's that we felt that there needed to be some times when we look to the right, when we look to the left, maybe we didn't know those women then, but they were part of the sisterhood that was here at a critical time in Yale's history. And that is the emphasis of this weekend. That's why. So, welcome, welcome, welcome. And it is my pleasure to salute all of us by having a toast and asking the president of Yale to come forward. Now, most of you have heard his stellar resume, and there's actually a glass up here for you, Peter. Most of you have heard her stellar resume, and you know the long version of all of his accolades. He is a man who has been here, who came for to do his PhD, and he met his wife at that point in time. They have been here on the university campus, where he is now the Chris Ardress Professor of Psychology. He has played a role as being not only a professor, but chair of his department, and the dean of the graduate school, the dean of the college, the provost, and he may be the 23rd president of Yale, but my favorite introduction to him is he is the man who is smart enough, confident enough, and lucky enough to be married to Marta Moret. Peter Sala.
Thank you. Vera, that was great.
And here's your wine.
Great, thank you. Vera, thank you. That was an amazing introduction, I have to say. One that I loved and Marta loved even more, I think. Well, look at yourselves. This is an amazing, amazing group. I can't tell you how thrilling it is for Marta and for me to be here with you and to welcome you back to campus. It is a pleasure. It's an honor. It's humbling, but it's also fantastic. And thank you for coming back. You know, Marta and I have another privilege, which is people thank us. We were greeting people as they came in the door, you all, and people saying, thank you for putting this on for us. And we didn't put it on for you. I just am lucky enough to work with a group of people who are willing to labor hard in putting wonderful tributes, wonderful events, wonderful commemorations together on behalf of this university. And the truth is, Marta got to say at that night that Vera was talking about, let's have a celebration. And the next thing you know, volunteers and Yale staff are working together to make it happen. And I just get to say thank you to all those people who pulled this weekend together. To Eve, to Linda, and to all the committee people, too many to mention by name, thank you for what you did. What people are telling me is that they're having the time of their life. They're delighted to be back, and that makes us all so, so grateful. So what a milestone. 50 years since Coeducation at Yale. And in our panel after dinner, we'll hear more about how that happened. But you all changed campus forever. You all, that is right. Give yourself a round of applause. I know you've been doing that all day, but Yale is an immeasurably better place in 2019 than it was certainly in 1701 because of what you did in 1969. And we are thankful for that. We are pleased to welcome so many of you back to campus, and we are especially gratified to hear about your experiences, whether we're speaking one-on-one or as part of a panel. Thank you for sharing all of that with us. So, as we commemorate 50 years, we salute the classes of 1970, 1971, 1972, 1973. There was no 1970. 1, 2, and 3. I got a little ahead of myself there. We wish there had been a 1970, but 71, 72, and 73. Your courage, your determination inspire us and inspire every member of the Yale community. So let's raise a glass to the trailblazers of coeducation in Yale College, to all the remarkable women who have made Yale what it is today. Cheers.
It had been my pleasure 10 years ago with my classmate Susan Yeeses, who some of you know, to, on behalf of the class of 1971, to host a luncheon celebrating 40 years of coeducation. We got pushed back on that, but we did it anyway at the Yale Club in New York. And that brought together, it's my understanding for the first time in about 20 to 25 years, John Wilkinson, who is here and we saw this morning, Sam, who's I've met for the first time 10 years ago, unfortunately, but also the person who...
Well, I feel the same way.
When I say unfortunately, that was my first time meeting him. And, I'm pleased that I met him then, but it's like, what took me so long? How did it take so long for me to meet him? But now he can't get rid of me. What can I say?
That's good.
And so he was the one I did not know, but the other person who was at that luncheon, whom I had met because she interviewed me for Yale, and because I worked for her with her in the summer of 1973, was Elga Wasserman. And I think Diana Wasserman is still in the room. Diana, are you still here? That was, to me, was the pivotal group that, made coeducation happen. And we heard the stories about how things happened, and we heard, about how we were selected, and these are the people who are just so important to us. And as we were involving John Wilkinson and other people about, this particular weekend, it was a little bit hard for us to convince Sam that he should be talking to us again. Because he's talked to us at the cluster reunion, he's talked to different reunion classes. It's like, what would make this different? And what he was willing to do was to do a fireside chat. He was willing, and he specifically would be honored to be interviewed by Margaret Warner. So you heard the longer introduction from Margaret this morning. You know that she had worked for PBS for a number of years. You know that she's involved with the Jackson Institute. So I'm going to get off the stage to just introduce the person who we've really come to hear, and that is the key person with Elga who made coeducation happen for us, who was the assistant working with Kingman Brewster, who was the secretary of the university, and who has been so involved with many aspects of Yale. And he is the voice of authority about how we came into being here at Yale, and is our inspiration. So do I make up for that?
Thank you, dear.
Thank you.
If I believe that.
It's so great to be here. Though, Sam, aren't you disappointed there's not a fire?
Well, I'm a little, I am disappointed, but I hope there's not a fire in the building.
Yeah, I do. I agree. Well, Vera, thank you so much. And friends I've been with have really remarked on how well produced this has been. I mean, I'm looking at some key people, and I don't know how you pulled it off. It's really fantastic. So, to you. So, we're going to talk for, I don't know.
Couple hours, 3 hours.
But I don't want to tread the same ground because everybody was there this morning, I assume, and this afternoon. But Sam, you were here incredibly for every event. What did we leave out? Was there something significant about what happened and how it happened that you'd like to highlight that you don't think was highlighted enough?
The first thing I would say is that in looking at anything historically, I'm not a historian, but all great historians tell me, you look at the context first. What was going on around? We had a wonderful panel this afternoon of people who talked about, Bev Gage was the chair, and talked about the general context in the United States at this time. In the little book I published about May Day, 1970, I have used the phrase, the era of challenge to authority. And I see this period as being a period in which we've come out of the Second World War, but we have a group of aged leaders, people who were much older. And then all of a sudden, Jack Kennedy was elected president. And to people my age then, I guess I was 25, 27 when Kennedy was elected, it was a whole new world opening up. The young were coming forward. We were going to get new leadership in everything we did. And then, of course, he was assassinated. And then Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy were assassinated. And these were our heroes, depending on who we were and so on. These were the great heroes. Then Rachel Carlson comes out with The Silent Spring and The Feminine Mystique and the Stonewall riots in Greenwich Village and the war in Vietnam. And all these challenges were out there, and young people from all over this country were saying, hey, wait a minute, we don't have the right leadership. They don't know what they're talking about. And we've got to change. And just parenthetically, one of the things Kingman Brewster said to me in this period was, you know, Sam, it's going to be interesting to see how many of these crazy ideas are the gospel 25 years from now. Well, they all became the gospel. I mean, virtually all of them. So I like to remember that nationally, this country was embroiled in a revolution in which young people were saying, we are tired of old leadership, and we want young leadership, and we want this country to change. Now then, let's look at Yale itself. Kingman Brewster became president in 1963 when Whit Griswold died, unhappily, of cancer. And almost immediately, Kingman had a wonderful way of being on vacation whenever something went wrong at Yale. And he and I had a deal that one of us always had, because I was his only assistant, and one of us had to be here. So all my conversations with Kingman many of these years were on long-distance telephones to the Caribbean or someplace like that. But the first protest at Yale was over not a national issue, but the failure of the philosophy department to grant tenure to a young man named Richard Bernstein. And none of us had ever even heard of a protest. And yet out in front of Woodbridge Hall, people were camped all night. Faculty members and their wives were serving dinner to the radicals. And we were sitting there in Woodbridge Hall feeling a little bit like we were under fire. This was a period in which Yale had terrible labor relations. And that was as much our fault as it was the unions. The administration never understood labor relations. We had terrible financial problems. Yale had a deficit for the entire 13 years of Brewster's presidency. The endowment was not big enough. We were trying to do too much. Kingman was trying to improve the faculty and pay more, but there was no money to do it. In 1964, Brewster invited five very distinguished scientists to come to Yale and examine the sciences at Yale. And the answer was, in a private memo, there are only 3 scientists at Yale that are worth a damn. Now imagine that. That's how bad the sciences had become. The alumni were up in arms over a whole series of issues, and they started an organization called Lux et Veritas, which was dedicated to getting Brewster out of office. There were the war issues, the civil rights issues, and Kingman was desperately trying to improve the faculty, both in the sciences and other fields. So the era in which you all were admitted, there was a whole lot of things going on outside. And those things were both consuming the minds and the thoughts of young people, but they were also, the things I've just mentioned at Yale, were consuming our lives. So much as admitting you was the most exciting thing that we did, we had a whole lot of other work to do.
You have opined in other settings that a major, I don't know if you said a great university, but changes rarely come in response to internal pressures, but external. Yet today we heard about that faculty were unhappy because the men weren't as accomplished as they'd like. And you know, we hear that the male students, the undergrads, were also agitating. But do you think your paradigm holds?
Yes. I would still argue that if there had not been a societal change coming in the role of women, that Yale would never have gone coeducation, or at least not at that time. But the pressures of the societal change were being felt by Princeton and by Yale and by Dartmouth, which were the only 3 Ivy League institutions that had no women involved with them. And I think that there were a couple of students, Lanny Davis, who was chairman of the News in 1966, 67, I think. He wrote an editorial every single day calling us the dumbest administrators in the entire world because we weren't admitting women. So he had an impact. But I do not think that someone said today, and it may have been Nancy Malkiel, that we were competitive with Princeton. I actually don't remember feeling competitive with Princeton. I thought we were competitive with Harvard, because they had Radcliffe and so on. I think the other thing, that the Vassar project, which did not work out, had gotten Yale kind of geared up. So I still think it was more external than internal.
Even though, so you're saying you think that the feminist movement was powerful enough at that early stage to create a context that kind of pushed.
Let me tell you a wonderful story. There was one morning when I realized that I had scheduled an appointment for Kingman to see who wrote The Feminine Mystique?
Betty Friedan.
Betty Friedan. I'd never met Betty Friedan, but the only appointment open was 8 o'clock in the morning. It was clear when Miss Friedan walked in that she had never been up before 11:30. It was also clear that she was very unhappy to be called at 8 o'clock in the morning to see the president of Yale. So she went in and she went out. And that was a day in which I knew I had to recommend to the president. We didn't have search committees, Peter, in those days. We just did things. I had to recommend the first woman master of a college, who was Kitty Lussman, Catherine Findling Lussman. So a little later you're right, great woman. a little later in the morning, I went in to see Kingman, and I said, I'd like to suggest that you appoint Kitty Lessman as the master of Davenport College. He got up and went to the window and looked out. Nothing said. He looked out, and he turned around and he said, "Is she a feminist?" So...
Well, then we really want to hear about Kingman Brewster, because this morning, I mean, I wrote in my notes, mystery man. Yeah. You were very close to him. I mean, we heard John Wilkinson talk about that he was under so many pressures, yeah. Money, the alums, and so forth. But what do you think was really at the heart of, and Kurt Schmoke said there was this committee on coeducation, and they'd actually prepare reports about what was missing here or there and hadn't been done, and he wouldn't read them. So fill us in on this character.
Kingman Brewster was born in the 1920s. He came from a very old New England family, but not, people thought he was very rich. He actually was not at all well-to-do. Indeed, that was a problem for him in his entire career. But he came from an old New England family. His father was a ne'er-do-well man who constantly was going to make millions, but never quite did it. His parents were divorced early. His mother, Florence Ballantyne, married a professor of music at the Harvard Music School and was an absolutely magnificent woman, way ahead of her time. She wasn't a feminist, but she was a feminist in the old world sense. Kingman was a radical as an undergraduate. He belonged to the American Firsters movement, which was opposed to going into the Second World War, and he and Charles Lindbergh were the two. He was the undergraduate leader, and Lindbergh was the national leader. So he was very radical as an undergraduate. He came to Yale and graduated, and then he went into the service first. He graduated and went into the service, and immediately entered the service when the country went into war. He just did a total about-face. Mary Louise Brewster, born in the same era, went to Vassar but left to marry him during the wartime, but she was also a trustee of Vassar afterwards. They both believed that single-sex education was the right way to go. And there was no doubt in their minds that from an educational point of view, this was the right thing to do.
What was the reasoning of that, behind that?
Margaret, I think, I'm not sure I ever got to the bottom of that, but I think they just believed it, almost in a sense that we've been brought up to believe that having a college education is a rather good thing. I think they just believed that single-sex education was right. Now, Kingman had a little bit of the old blue, Stover at Yale, the kind of old blue that this is a man's world and so on. So I think that was part of it. But the second thing I want to say about Kingman is that he was the quintessential pragmatic. And I will never forget the night after Vassar had said they didn't want to come. Charles Taylor, who was the longtime provost, and he and I were contemporaries, really. We both were in college in the 50s, and we both wanted to have real coeducation. And Charlie and I were sitting talking to Kingman, and the drumbeat was going, and I think it was Charlie who turned to Kingman and said, "Look, Kingman, there's a snowball up there, and it's coming down the hill, and you have a choice. You can get under it, and we'll never see you again, or you can step aside and try to help direct it." And the light went on with Brewster, just like that. And he said, "You're telling me we have to be coeducation?" And we said, "Yes." And he said, "Okay, let's do it." But he was very pragmatic. And he didn't compromise basic ethical principles, but he knew enough to see when things were changing. when we decided originally that all the women were going to live in one college,
Yes.
and it was going to be Trumbull College. And he went to the meeting, John Wilkinson referred to it, he went to a meeting in Trumbull College. The only time I ever worried about Kingman's welfare, physical welfare, because they'd built a stage that was sort of little tiny thing like this, but it looked like it was going to collapse anyway. And the students were really angry. And he heard it all, he listened to it all, and as we were walking out, he said, I think we just got the message. And so we changed.
That's a
And I
pragmatist.
think it was a good idea.
Most of us, or many of us, saw this film last night. We saw several, but there was a terrific one, and I don't know who produced it. I'm sorry if that person's here. I think it might have been made for the 1989 reunion. In any event, a much, should I say, much younger Mr. Chauncey is talking. And you described, so I couldn't really take notes, but this very, to me, strange attitude about the intellectual capabilities of women that were prevalent. You talked about that some men thought women just weren't up to it, to the intellectual jousting. Tell us about that.
I honestly don't remember that particular movie, so I'm not sure I can,
No, but I mean, just the subject.
pick up on that. Well, there were all kinds of different people at Yale. And I remember a man named George Pearson. That name will mean something to Judy and some of the rest of you, the great Yale historian. George Pearson was commissioned by first Whit Griswold and then Kingman to create the best history department in the United States. This was about 1961. And George went about doing it. And he had two prejudices: no women in Yale College and no Jewish people in Yale College. So who were his first two hires? John Blum, a Jewish man from MIT, and Mary Wright, a professor of Chinese history. And I thought to myself, George has been converted. He's come around. He sees the light. In one of you, maybe someone in this room, came to see me in the first term and said that they had been in George Pearson's class and that she was one of two women, and that George had announced at the beginning of this term that it was a 50-minute class, and that he would talk for 35 minutes, and then we'd have discussion, and then 5 minutes would be assigned for the women's point of view.
Oh.
So you had this really complex situation of people who, on the one hand, got the message about what was going to go on, and on the other hand, they would retreat back. They couldn't get themselves out of the past. And I think maybe that's what I was talking about in this event, because there were so many different points of view about why we were taking women. And they ranged from, the admissions office said we can't get any men unless you admit women, the societal pressure business. There were some people who actually believed that Yale had an obligation to educate the other 50% of the population, and that might be a good idea. But there was no prevailing philosophy. This all happened so fast. You've got to remember that the corporation voted in November of '68, and Elga and I had to get everything done by August of the next year. The admissions, the facilities, everything. And so I'm not proud of this, but I want to underscore the fact there was no great underlying philosophy. Nancy again talked about the fact that maybe we'd kind of rushed into this too quickly, and the answer was we did, and you rushed in too quickly, and it was a good idea. But I think that was I think the fact that you must not look for a philosophy in this event. It didn't exist. A lot of people had a lot of different reasons why women were coming. The great, I know you want to come back to this, but the great anchor was Elga Wasserman. Because Elga had the capacity, on the one hand, to be a damn good administrator and to get things done. On the other hand, as I said at Maury's last night, Elga was a pioneer and she had a vision. And pioneers who have visions never quite accomplish everything they want to get done. But she had a vision in which Yale would have, on the faculty, in the student body, in the administration, 50% men and 50% women at every level and every rank. And that was what true coeducation meant. To Elga, it wasn't just admitting undergraduate women. It was the whole damn ballgame. So if we ever had any philosophy that we adopted later, it was Elga's philosophy. And she was the one who brought that to us. It didn't work. We haven't yet quite succeeded in achieving Elga's goal. But I think that's the way it turned out.
And how did she feel about being sidelined? I mean, it sounds like President Brewster didn't, I mean, on the one hand, he depended on her. She was doing half the job you were, but this business about not giving her a real position, she was an assistant. What was that about?
Well, let me tell you two things. I'll give you an analogy because I think some of you may understand it better, and then I'll bring it back to Elga. A lot of you have heard of Bill Coffin, the great chaplain of the time, and Bill was himself a revolutionary in the best sense of the word, and passionate in his belief about civil rights and the draft and the anti-Vietnam War. Kingman and Bill Coffin fought like tigers day after day after day, but you could never have found two better friends. They fought all the time because Bill was the idealist. Kingman had to make the damn place run. And so they were clashing with each other every day of the week, and yet they loved each other. Now, I won't say that Elga and Kingman loved each other, but they deeply respected each other. And yet, I mean, I think that's, as it turns out, I think it's very healthy for a university because anyone who's president, I mean, this man knows better than anybody in the world, his president, constantly visionaries and missionaries are coming and saying, you help me make my thing work. And how many dozens come into a president of a university every year? I don't know, but there's a whole lot of them. And they want money, and they want help, and they want everything. The president favors certain ones of those because he or she thinks it's a good idea. And Kingman ultimately believed that coeducation was a good idea. But Elga never, as Bill never did, Elga never stopped believing in her principle and her goal for this institution. And Kingman never stopped trying to make it work. And so the conflict, which is perhaps overplayed as an angry, or I don't think that ever existed. Now, as to her title, that was a very separate issue. Elga wanted to be the associate dean or the deputy dean of Yale College. The dean of Yale College did not want to be told by the president who was going to be his deputies or his assistants.
And who was the dean?
Georges May, professor of French, wonderful man. But he would not accede to being told from Woodbridge Hall who was going to be in his office. He felt that was his prerogative and that he was going to appoint the people. And it may have been a mistake for us to go to Georges and ask him to make this appointment, because maybe if he had thought it up, it might have happened. So I think that's a separate issue which gets into the politics of how universities operate.
So it was not anything deeper that Kingman didn't want someone so strong.
I happen to have actually felt, and I talked to Elga about this, I happen to have actually thought she had more power as an assistant to the president than she would have had as an associate dean of Yale College. I just thought in the scheme of things it might have been a better, but her view, and it was based in her feeling about the academic side in many ways, that being an associate dean was a more important academic position as opposed to being an administrator.
So I know other people, I asked this morning and it got a laugh, but I'd really like to know, how did it happen that even the most basic, like having bathrooms in the classroom buildings, was overlooked?
I have to tell you a story first.
Stories are great.
There was a registrar of Yale College whose name was Ronald C. Marsh. He graduated in the class of 1917. And he was registrar from 1917 until God knows when. He was in the Strathcona, and he had 13 ladies who worked for him. And they all sat there with pencils recording grades. Ronald always wore the same attire. He changed, got it cleaned and stuff, but he always wore a very heavy gray suit. This is in the era of no coeducation, of no air conditioning. He wore a stiff, detachable white collar and a Yale blue tie. One of the 13 ladies who worked in his office was Mrs. Marsh. We were not allowed to call her Vesta. She was to be called Mrs. Marsh. Ronald had on his desk a telephone and a key. And each day, if a lady wished to make a telephone call, she had to stand right next to Ronald and make the telephone call. And if she wanted to go to the ladies' room, and there was one in SSS then on the 8th floor, she had to take the key from Ronald, and Ronald only allowed them to go once in the morning and once in the afternoon.
Wow.
Now, bathrooms were a problem.
It seems to have been for generations.
We worried first about these sorts of things in the places where the women were going to live and make sure that those were all working. And there was a famous story about my wanting to take the showers out of Vanderbilt and put bathtubs because my 5 sisters had said women wanted bathtubs, and then the women said, no, you leave them in there. But there were so many buildings at Yale that in the 7 months that we had to do everything else, we did not have time. Somebody went around and looked in every place, but we just didn't get it done. We had too little time to get it done. Remember, one nice person who was here, saw me earlier, reminded me that she lives in New York, and she said, you know, to have all the permits to renovate your kitchen in New York City takes longer than we had in order to get all this done for all the women. So
That is remarkable.
We're guilty.
Well, all of us who've done renovations can sympathize with that. Well, I want to get to questions from the audience, but sitting back and reflecting now, one, how momentous do you think it was, coeducation? And in the sort of roster of really urgent emergencies that you had to deal with, where does this rank, and please don't flatter us, but where does that, having women here, rank in what you've achieved and the greatest legacy?
Well, I'll start one step higher. Many of you may know Professor Jay Gitlin in the history department, who's really our sort of university historian. He's not officially that, but he knows a lot about Yale history. And he teaches a class that relates to Yale history, which I attend. And he and I have a big argument about when did the old Yale become the new Yale. And my argument is that the period of the challenge to authority, the period of your coming to Yale, is the period in which the old Yale becomes the new Yale, because it involves women, minority students. It involves the period in which the Yale faculty recognizes that there are really good PhDs other than Yale PhDs, and we begin having men and later women come from the great state universities where they've always taught women. And so I think this era, and I won't pick a particular part of it, but to say this is the time that the old Yale became the new Yale. As to the sort of relative maybe difficulty or so on, we worked much further ahead in planning for the admission of minority students. That is, Arthur Howe had actually started a program in 1956 or 57 called the ABC program. And we began planning. And so by the time a larger group of black students came, we'd already developed the Afro-American Studies Department. We'd already developed the Afro-American Cultural Center. And so I think that was the one that we probably did the best job on. I'm not saying it was a perfect job, but I think we did the best job. And we had magnificent students who came in that first tranche of people. I would rank the coeducation thing as the second most difficult because we only had 7 months, but there's no doubt that having only 6 weeks to prepare for May Day was the most difficult of the things I was involved with. But I will also say that this guy learned more from those 3 events than he ever learned in the rest of his life. I mean, I learned so many different things about people, about human nature. I learned about minority events that never would have occurred to me if it hadn't been for those students beating on our door, pushing us hard for financial aid and those kinds of things. And the same with all of you. I learned an enormous amount. I mean, I think those kinds of experiences are what really make your life. And they were early in my life, so I was lucky.
So can you give us one example that is emblematic of that?
Yeah. Is Shirley Daniels here?
Yes.
Where is she? Shirley Daniels. Shirley and another minority student, Euclid Irving, were assigned by the Black Student Association to deal with me. And I don't know, Shirley, how many times, I recall we met Friday at, I don't know, 11 o'clock every morning or something like that. And, you know, I kind of thought, you know students, they won't show up after the first couple of meetings. Well, Shirley and Euclid were there every single Friday. And every single Friday they pushed me about the financial, we were talking primarily about financial aid. I learned things that I never would have learned. I came from a family that didn't have a lot of money. I was a scholarship student at Yale, but I was very lucky. I came from a family that had, but I didn't understand the fact that, for example, that if a minority student came here, it was not only needing the financial aid, but it was the loss of his or her income to the family income that was devastating for the family. Well, now this is the kind of thing I wouldn't have ever learned if it hadn't been for Shirley and Euclid coming after me. And I think that was incredibly important in my education to see issues that I didn't ever encounter in my own life.
Let's open, this is fascinating, Sam. I could continue for quite a while, but I know people here would like to ask some questions.
Are you going to sort of filter them in case they're angry?
No, because you sound as if you were incredibly adept at handling that sort of thing. So I know I ignored the right side of the room today, so I want to take questions from wherever they come. But yes, the lady in the red jacket. Are there microphones?
Are there any microphones? Here we go.
I'm Barbara Wagner, class of '73. We've heard a lot of talk about Yale and Princeton and Harvard and the Ivy League. And I have a very good friend who went to the University of Virginia the next year, the first co-educated class, which was virtually done under court order, and they didn't even bother taking out the urinals because they didn't want, no one wanted the women there. I'm curious whether Yale paid, was the Ivy League oblivious to, and I have another friend who went to the University of North Carolina in the first freshman class that admitted women in 1965. I'm curious if Yale was following the trends among other previously all-male schools, or was it totally focused on the Ivy League and aware of not just the trend of coeducational schools and faculty who had taught at state universities, but other schools around the country that were starting to go co-ed?
I'm a little, I'm ashamed of this answer, and I was ashamed this morning, I guess it was, when the panel that had Nancy Malkiel and company on it, some of whom were a little critical on our planning, we did not really know we were going to be coeducational until November of 1968. The trustees on the whole we thought were favorable, but there were 2 or 3 who felt so strongly against it we weren't sure how the board would actually vote. And from that moment on, it was like being in a long distance race. You just had to start running. So we did not do any studies or anything. The only thing we did that was really smart, and I am unable to remember her name, someone may here remember, there was a wonderful woman who had been president of Barnard and president of, became vice chancellor of UCLA, and her name will come to me, but we did ask her to come and talk to us about coeducation and some of the ideas, and she was wonderful and brilliant. But we didn't do studies or anything like that. We just got our head down and figured out how we were going to get 500 women into the place, where we were going to house them, how we were going to make them as safe as we could, and those issues. So I'm embarrassed to answer this question that way, but no, we did not.
I'll go here and then there. Yeah. Go.
Here you go, right behind you.
So my question, I'm Caroline Bertel. I'm from Jonathan Edwards College, class of '71. So I have a scrapbook, and there are actually 2 letters from Yale in that scrapbook. There's one that's in March saying, you now have, we're now asking you to send additional materials. And then there was the dated something like April 19th, the actual acceptance letter. And so I was wondering if you could explain a little bit about the process that went on, and also were you overwhelmed by the number of applications? Were they more than you expected, less than you expected?
Well, as to expected, we had no idea how many applicants would be. But remember that the decision was made in November of 1968. The admission of men for that year had already begun. And so the admissions office, the undergraduate admissions office, was already underway admitting a class of men. So we made the decision, Elga and I made the decision, that we would let them do the paperwork. They had to assemble all the documents, send out the printed materials and so on, but that she and I would do the whole admissions process ourselves. So I'm not sure, but I think we got 11,000 applicants. But I'm not 100% sure of that figure, but I think that's what it was. So we knew that we couldn't get our work done as fast as the male team was getting, the admission of men was getting done. So I think we sent out materials instead of what you would do in a normal admissions process. If we saw something was missing, we immediately wrote to that person and said, we didn't get your teacher's report, or we didn't get this, or we didn't get that. So it was a little bit of sort of rolling along, and we'd make a decision that this person was going to get in, and we put that file aside. I have a vivid memory of a March night. It was a miserable night, and I walked back to my home with one of those great big file boxes with nothing but admissions folders in it. I don't know how many hundred were in it. And I knew I had to read them all before the next morning. And I looked down the file, and they all looked exactly the same. You could see the pink form and the blue form and the white form, but then there was one in the middle that was very thick. And I said to myself, that's the only one that's going to be interesting. And so I put it at the very end, because I knew I had to stay awake, and that one would keep me awake. So it was a process. Now, in the one of the panels, they talked about the things that Elga and I were thinking about as we admitted women, and the famous remark I made that if you had 4 brothers, you got in. Well, that was absolutely true. And there was one woman the other night who came, and there you are back there. She had 4 brothers. If you had 3 brothers, you were likely to get in, and if you had 2, we certainly looked hard. The second thing we looked for was women who had experiences that would toughen them up. And that might have been being a violinist who had achieved some kind of national stature. It might have been an athlete who had achieved some kind of stature. There was another woman who I talked with today who had lived for the previous 2 years before applying in other countries. So we, of course, had a kind of academic cutoff, but we were mostly looking for people because we knew that this was going to be a very difficult place for a lot of women to come to. And I think we avoided, and I hope we didn't avoid them all, but I think we avoided a woman who was an only child. Okay, apparently we didn't. Okay. Maybe we didn't know. But anyway, we were reluctant to admit someone who we thought might find the hostility of the masculine campus something that they couldn't deal with.
So, can I?
Oh, go
Yeah.
ahead.
My name is Chris Citroen, class of 71. I'd like to ask you about probably everyone's most heated choke point was Yale's obligation to the nation to produce 1,000 future male leaders of America. And many of us, if you asked, this would be the number one thing was a controversy. And I would like to know what your conversations with him about that were.
Yeah. To be sure everyone knows the context, Kingman had said, and I don't remember exactly when he first said it, that we were obligated to educate 1,000 male leaders. Never has a greater mistake ever been made by a Yale president than saying that. And I guess we sort of knew it pretty quickly on. It came in part from our fear of what the alumni reaction would be to the admission of women, because we didn't have any, talk about not making studies, we hadn't sort of polled the alumni or done anything to find out how they feel. We had the sense that the alumni would be very opposed to coeducation. That was wrong. As John Wilkinson said this morning, the minute a male alumnus woke up and realized he had a daughter, he all of a sudden thought this was a good idea. But having said that, Brewster had the problem of how to back off of it. This was combined with the way we were going to deal with it was we were going to build 2 new residential colleges on the corner of Grove and Whitney. And we had the money, and we had the plans drawn, and we had the building, everything torn down in the corner, and then, of course, the city of New Haven wouldn't give us the permit to build them. So that pulled the rug out from under there. I think Kingman knew he had made a mistake, but I think he felt, having made the public statement, that he had to sort of back it up. but he gently backed off, and I can't actually remember the exact numbers as the years go on, but I think he was willing to back off of that, but he didn't want to have to make a public statement about it. Everybody told him it was a mistake. No, I mean, I don't want to, that's too easy to say. When he said it, I knew why he was saying it. We had come out of a meeting in New York with the Lux et Veritas group that were out for his scalp, and they told us if we admitted women, they were going to come after us. And so I would actually have to say I went along with him when he made it, but it was a terrible mistake.
You said something in an interview following up on that in the Yale Alumni Magazine, the new one on the stands or whatever, that something about, speaking of context, that Kingman also was looking at fellow Ivy leaders who were losing their jobs.
Yes.
Okay, explain that a little.
In this period, and I can't give you all the exact dates, Nate Pusey at Harvard, Grayson Kirk at Columbia, Gaylord Harnwell at Penn, one other, all lost their jobs because radical movements had resulted in terrible injury, fires, people died, and it was felt that these individuals were not up to the times and so on. And Kingman was constantly trying to wend his way between the two. Nancy Malkiel mentioned something today which is, I think, worth talking about, and that was, she mentioned that Kingman had made a comment about his belief that a black person could not get a fair trial in the United States. The second one was his anti-Vietnam War declaration. One of the things that Kingman and I talked about, and Charlie Taylor, enormous amount, was what is right for a university president to talk about that's of a national stature, as opposed to a local university thing. And so on the fair trial, the black person getting a fair trial, we were going into the May Day business. The judge in the Bobby Seale trial, in preliminary hearings, had seen two black men in the back of the room reading a newspaper, and he had found them in contempt of court and put them in jail. And this just went like a spark. And the students at Yale were enraged, and the black community in New Haven was enraged. And Kingman, as a lawyer, was enraged to have seen a judge do that. So we spent 48 hours writing that sentence. And then he put it in a talk to the Yale College faculty and allowed the Yale News to attend the faculty meeting. He wanted that statement out. In the Vietnam War, he eventually made a very strong statement against the Vietnam War. A lot of people don't know that one of Kingman's very closest friends was McGeorge Bundy, who at that time was the national security advisor to Lyndon Johnson. Mac Bundy was one of the architects of the Vietnam War. I remember two occasions with Kingman and Mac, one in the Caribbean and one in New Haven, in which the shouting match was really something as they fought over the issue. And I remember I said to Mac, "You should get out of that damn place." And he looked at me and he said, "You're un-American." This was really bitter stuff between people who were all friends. I mean, we all liked each other. But Kingman's belief was that if the national issue affected the student body or the faculty, he had an obligation to speak out on it. And that was the place he drew, the line.
Which I think, I won't ask Peter to comment, but presidents, I mean, Rick Levin dealt with that, and you know, are you an intellectual leader in this country, but you know, where do you go?
Yeah.
Where is the line? Now there's someone over here in navy blue who's been dying to speak. Go ahead. Oh no, wait, you
need a microphone.
Up and you need a microphone.
This is very trivial, and it goes back 3 questions. What was the role of Inky Clark in admitting women?
When Arthur Howe resigned as Dean of Admissions, and Arthur Howe is an under-recognized man in Yale history. He was the one who really believed in the admission of minority students and started the talk, and he was the one who suggested to the New York Times that women ought to be admitted in 1956. And Whit Griswold had that wonderful, called him in and said, Arthur, I agree with you about admitting women, but don't you ever dare say it again.
At least in public.
In public, yeah. He resigned in 1963 to go head the American Field Service, and Kingman decided that that staff that was there was too old and not a modern group of admissions people, and so he chose Inky Clark to head it up. Clark was carrying out what Arthur Howe had started in many ways. Inky Clark was great. He hired a magnificent young group of people to come in and do this thing. He did what he was asked to do, which was to change the face of Yale. His great weakness was that he had no sense of diplomacy. And he was abrupt and straightforward. What he said was right, but he kind of said it in a way that was a little bit angry. And but he was very good because he brought the institution from an old-fashioned way of looking at things to a modern way. And I think Inky felt he'd done his job. He didn't stay too long. I can't remember the number of years, maybe 6 years at the most. And then he became headmaster of a school somewhere. But he was a great guy and he was good at it, but boy, he never went to diplomatic school.
No, and with the alums. Yes, Congresswoman.
Presidents matter, and I wanted to say, Sam, that Kingman Brewster mattered. Thank you, Martha, very much. And to Mirtha and to Peter, it's not disrespectful, but the tone that you've set in 2019 makes a difference. I just want to take this brief moment to go back a point or two on the question of the African American students, Shirley and Euclid, and the diligence in which the cultural groups made a difference. And I'm going to pose the question in that context. At the reception earlier, we were introduced to the cultural houses miraculously under your leadership in terms of that era. They're 50 years old too. Yeah. No one would ever even imagine that they're 50 years old. The Women's Studies program, I think that was enormously innovative to have those programs at that time, even though we were reaching for diversity. So let me just focus on the Afro-American House. As you well know, that was not done without pain. Mm-hmm. You made the point that there were brilliant men initially that came, scholars themselves, that pushed the university for the vitality and the importance of understanding African American history. I love Yale for the fact that I think history was really a theme that ran through our studies. Dr. Lewis Gates is a product of Yale University. We should never, he happens to be a man, forgive me, but he was very respectful of women students at the time. But the point is that we should never shy away from being more superior than Princeton on this experiment. Anybody went to grad school, that's okay. We should never shy away for what we went through. And I'll just throw a personal anecdote, then I will just pose a question, so I'll move quickly as possible. There was a question earlier today about how you compared 1969 in terms of change to now 2019. So forgive me, my classmates. This happens to also be the year of return. This is 400 years for enslaved Africans who arrived in New England in 1619. What an interesting time to come and do all of these historical things at that time. But we became the mother of African American studies programs across America. We're not celebrating that now, but I'm just trying to put together all the historic, I think, moments, Sam, that we were going through, if I'm correct. Just this year, I took up something that people would initially respond to as, what is a member of Congress engaged in this kind of debate? And that is, of course, the H.R. 40 is a commission to study reparations proposals. And my goal was to reflect on where I came from, but also Yale's pioneering spirit about history. And so I view this commission as an attempt, hasn't been passed yet, but it's going further than it's ever gone, leadership of the House and members of Congress from all over the nation co-sponsoring it. But the point is that it's about racial reconciliation, and then ultimately, what do you do in that period of history? My question for you, as you laid the groundwork for many of these folk, the Blasingame, if you remember, you brought him here. He was considered a genius in terms of building that department. Miss Boone, that Shirley highlighted. What do you view mixing women with that? How do you view that as a significant part of the leadership, this whole cultural revolution of acknowledging Asians, Hispanics, Latinos, African Americans, women, all groups that had heretofore been left out, and we, and seemingly in that period of time, were acknowledging all of them. I hope I got everybody in the Women's Studies program. Did you all talk about that significance? Did the Yale Corporation Board, were they impressed? Did they know what you did?
Maybe not, which was also good.
And I sit down on this note. Do they know that you kept New Haven from imploding in May of '79 when Kingman shut down the university and said, everybody go out of class? I remember when I know there was some in '69, it was 70, May Day. 70, the spring of 70, when they let us out, as they say, because I remember in July, sort of digging myself in to get those papers in that we didn't get in at that time.
Yes.
But I mean, all of that was with women here. And I want to say to the women who are here, you were part of keeping the lid on. You really were. I think you were. I mean, most of you were involved in this, and you kept the lid on while we were really in one of the most explosive historical moments, not hysterical, moments of history. And we had all these different groups because the African American students were holed up at one of the secret societies. Somebody else was somewhere else. Other people were hanging out in commons. We all had our spaces, but we all seemed to know that the administration respected our dignity and were going to stand with us on that dignity. Otherwise, this place could have, I won't finish the sentence, but I yield back, as they say on the floor of the House. Do they know the significance of it? I guess that's my question.
Let me try and answer a couple of questions that are sort of embedded there. First of all, the Yale trustees, the Yale Corporation at that time was incredibly supportive. Some of you will remember the meetings in the rink, 7,000 people in the rink to argue over ROTC or whatever it was we were arguing over. And when we had one of those meetings, we called the members of the corporation, and I would say of the 16 members, aside from the president, 14 were there for every event and sat in the rink and participated. They didn't speak, I don't think, but they were there. So they were very supportive. We also had 4 great Afro-American trustees at the time. 3 were women, Marion Wright Edelman, Eleanor Holmes Norton, and Barbara Preiskell. And then Judge Leon Higginbottom of the federal court was also. And those people gave us guidance and understanding that we might never otherwise have had. Secondly, about the cultural houses. I don't remember how we learned it, but we knew that if you had, no matter how many initial let's say black students we admitted, they had to have a place of a sense of safety and getting together and so on. And so the idea of the cultural house seemed to us to be almost the number one thing that ought to be done. With regard to the Afro-American Studies major, the great heroes of this were a black student named Robbie Robinson and Charles Taylor, the provost. And Charlie, who was provost, and therefore he had a lot of things to do, undertook to personally develop with Robbie, who was a senior, and there were other students on the committee, I've forgotten all their names, but to undertake the development of that major with the faculty. And I think everybody understood that in addition to needing a place where a small group of people could feel comfortable, you needed an intellectual place in which they could also feel comfortable. And so the development of the Afro-American Studies major was to us of the highest priority.
Fascinating. Questions? Yes, the lady in the blue.
We've been talking a lot about the arrival of women in 1969.
I'm sorry, the what?
Sorry, Judith Vecchione, 1973, and Berkeley College. We've been talking a lot about the arrival of women at Yale, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the first years of women on campus as part of Yale College, and particularly the belief that I had always had, but maybe it's not true, maybe it's imaginary, that we were called the experiment in coeducation for the entire time that I was here.
Is Ann here? Ann Perkins? I guess she's not here. If you have not read Ann's book, you absolutely must read it. She has written a PhD dissertation, which is transformed into a very good history book, which documents the first 2 years of coeducation at Yale. And I can't make it any better. I will say about it a couple of things. One is that I think without Elga, we would have had a really tough time, because I think she was our spiritual leader as well as our administrative leader. And I think she was the one who kept the fires burning in those first 2 years, and kept the fire underneath our behinds, which was important. What was the second part? Oh, the experiment. Yeah, I don't know where that came from. It was not we were not going to back off, so there was never an intention that we'd try it out and see if it worked and then decide again. I don't know where that came from, except I think it may have come as from someone who was unhappy that we weren't admitting more women, and therefore used this as a kind of derogatory comment. But there was never any intention of backing off and going back at all.
Is someone raising their hand way back there? Yes.
I'm curious, Bliss Williams Brown, Davenport 71. I'm curious whether the administration ever did anything to prepare the men for our arrival.
Great question.
I'm gonna take the liberty of, before I answer your question, somebody today in the afternoon seminar said something that I think is incredibly important. We need to teach men about themselves. We need a mandatory course for Yale males, because the masculinity of Yale is not yet gone. It's still very much a part of the institution. Now, over to your question. Absolutely nothing. And I mean it. Nothing was done. I'm not sure, but there were groups of men who wanted to be hospitable. And I think in individual colleges and individual groups, there were things that happened where men tried to be welcoming and friendly and stuff like that. There is some disagreement, say, between John Wilkinson and myself. I think there were more undergraduate men who were against coeducation than he does. I think there were a fair number, I would think maybe 50% of the men who, it wasn't they didn't like women or something, it was just that they thought Yale should be male. So but we didn't do anything to educate the men.
Right there. Oh, let's get the microphone. It's
Right
coming
behind
your
you.
way.
Speaking at Glenn Murphy, Calhoun 71, speaking as a male who was at Yale during both before and after the coeducation, I would remind you that Co-Ed Week was instigated by the male undergraduate
Avi
population. Avi Soifer.
Yep.
And we managed to accommodate 750 women without the world spinning off its axis. So I think it's fair to say that the male undergraduate population, not in its entirety, but was out ahead of you as far as coeducation was concerned and didn't need any institutional preparation to make it happen.
I'm gonna pick a fight with you, okay? I don't think that's what the questioner was talking about. You're absolutely right. Avi Soifer did a fabulous job of putting together Coeducation Week, and 400 or 500 women came to Yale and spent the week, went to classes, lived in the dorms and everything. But I think the question is a different question. And that is that this institution, since 1701 until 1969, was all male, and it developed an atmosphere and an ethos which is embedded in every wall and every ceiling and every floor of the institution. Everyone says, and I'm a fan of Morey's today, but everyone says Morey's is, they take women in, they have all these nice parties and so on. You just go into the first floor and find me a picture of a woman.
Yeah.
There's no picture of any woman on the first floor. They're on the stairway. They're up the stairs. They're hidden. Now, I don't want to pick on Morey's, but I firmly believe, because I got so passionate about admitting women to Yale, I have spent my time thinking about this subject. I have 5 or 6 undergraduate advisees every year. I got about 20 in college now. Half of them roughly are women. They tell me that they feel that Yale is still a masculine institution. And now they're not scared, they're not afraid, they're going about their business. But I think men have to learn about masculinity. Here we have women's studies. We don't have men's studies. Now, you laugh, but listen, men are not so good at understanding when they get together as a group how, at a place like Yale, how offensive they can be. Mm-hmm. So, I know what you're talking about, and I agree that Co-Ed Week was a great thing, but I think if I hate to tell the president what to think about, but I do believe that if we want to be really co-educational, one of the things we have to do is to teach men to understand what being masculine is and how it affects the other sex. End of that.
Very interesting. I think, am I getting the signal? I think we have time. Oh, yes, right here.
Hi, I'm Jan Costello.
Don't get mad at me.
Branford, class of 1972. Like many of you, I'm sure, I have been an alumni school's volunteer interviewer for many years, and I've been told by high school students applying that Yale is well known now as the gay-friendly Ivy. When people were talking about the cultural houses, it brought back memories when I was here as a student and volunteered for Dwight Hall, and there was a homosexuality discussion group that gradually changed its name openly to Gays at Yale. When we talk about bringing women to a men's school, I remember there was some discussion about this was a good thing because it would make sure that there were heterosexual manly men at Yale. And having close friends who were gay men at the time, although I didn't have a close woman friend who identified as gay or lesbian, I'm sure there are, it was still sort of not a manly thing to do. The other thing is that I won an award as a junior, and for the qualities that the award was named for, and one of them was manliness. And I used this a lot in law school applications of like, hey, and not only was I a good student, but I was manly. It's always raised this question for me. It was, Yale is the mother of men, and you'd swim naked in the pool, and you'd lunch with the other guys at Maury's, and there was a reinforcement of a particular kind of masculinity, but it was a masculinity that presumably was quite fearful of being perceived as feminine in any way. So I'm wondering now, at what point the change in Yale became such that it is perceived as a friendly ivy for gay, lesbian, queer, binary, transgender, the whole new area of gender. Back when we were going to Yale, it was, you're a man or a woman, but now there's gender and gender identity. And if we're talking about how you identify yourself as a person in a still masculine environment like this, I think that'd be a really interesting area to discuss and to explore. Going back in time to 1969, did this come up in discussion that we wanted, the kind of men we wanted Yale to admit were manly heterosexual men, and we would bring in women to make that possible? Or did nobody even talk about it?
No, in 1969, that subject wouldn't have come up because those kinds of subjects didn't come up ever in 1969. But I will say this, and I'm retired. I'm not an administrator now, but I will say this based on my advisees and other students I know. I marvel at how different the world is today and the view of undergraduates today about sexual issues. It's a totally different world than the world I was brought up in, and maybe some of you, I don't know. I'm a lot older than you are. But there's no question that all these issues, I don't know whether Yale's more gay friendly or any other friendly than any other institution. I just don't know whether there are statistics that would bear that out or not. But I do know that the issue of sexual identity or sexual orientation or something like that is really a kind of not high on people's agenda in meeting each other. I mean, they may be interested in the subject of sexual identity and want to talk about it in a class or in a discussion group. But there are students at Yale who are friends of students who have other sexual identity than they do, and they just all get along fine. So to me, that's an issue that us old-timers have to learn to deal with.
This will be the last question, and it's the lady also in blue, gray. Yes, you.
Hi, I'm Janet Weiss, class of 73. Earlier, you said you had a disagreement with Jay Gitlin about when the old Yale became the new Yale, and you gave us your answer. I'm curious about what his answer is.
I wish Jay were here and could defend himself. I think Jay is undecided. I think he thinks I'm wrong, but I don't think he knows where he actually thinks the old Yale became the new Yale, and I'm not sure actually whether he thinks it has become the new Yale. So he may be, as an historian, he may see this more on a kind of gradual level of moving forward, whereas I see this particular era as very abrupt, very different, very changing. But I'm reluctant to give you a particular time. He also was interested in the period of when Yale moved from being a seminary, if you will, that is, training people to go into the ministry, and it had its first non-clerical president or rector. So, but I don't think he ever has given me a specific date or time that he went along with. So I feel badly I can't answer it, but I really can't.
So please join me in thanking Sam Chauncey. That was fabulous.
Thank you,
I mean,
Mark.
really fabulous.